The golden cage Isabella Chen stepped out of her white Tesla, the morning sun glinting off her designer sunglasses as she surveyed the towering glass facade of the Serenity Bay Resort. At 22, she possessed the kind of effortless beauty that came from a lifetime of privilege: silky black hair that caught the light, delicate features that had never known worry, and a wardrobe that cost more than most people's annual salaries. This wasn't how she'd planned to spend her summer, but her mother had been insistent. 6 months, Victoria Chen had declared from behind her mahogany desk. You'll learn the business from the ground up, or you'll find yourself cut off from the family fortune. The ultimatum still stung, but Isabella had assumed ground up meant starting in management, not actually mingling with the help. The resort's marble lobby was impressive, she had to admit, with its soaring ceilings and cascading water features. Isabella made her way to the front desk, her heels clicking authoritatively against the polished floor. She was here to meet with Marcus Thompson, the hotel manager. But her attention was immediately drawn to an older man mopping near the entrance. He appeared to be in his 50s, with graying hair and weathered hands that spoke of years of manual labor. His uniform was pristine, but there was something about the way he moved, deliberately, observantly, that struck her as odd. When their eyes met briefly, she noticed his were sharp, almost analytical, before he quickly looked away and continued his work. "Miss Chen?" Thompson approached, a practiced smile on his face. "Welcome to Serenity Bay. Your mother has told us so much about you." Isabella barely acknowledged him, still watching the janitor. Is that man always so slow with his work? I've been standing here for 5 minutes, and he's barely covered any ground. Marcus glanced over, his expression tightening slightly. Thomas is one of our most dedicated employees. He's been with us for several months now, and he's very thorough. Thorough, Isabella scoffed, more like inefficient. In the fashion industry, we'd never tolerate such poor time management. She raised her voice slightly, ensuring the janitor could hear. I suppose not everyone can work at a professional pace. Thomas paused in his mopping, and for a moment, Isabella thought she saw something flash across his face. Amusement, disappointment, but he simply nodded politely and moved to another section of the lobby, as Marcus led her on a tour of the facilities. Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the janitor. He seemed to appear everywhere they went, adjusting a crooked picture in the restaurant, replacing towels in the spa, checking the pool equipment. Each time, his eyes would linger on her for just a moment too long, as if he were studying her reactions to everything she saw. Does that janitor have access to the entire property? She asked Marcus, as they rode the elevator to the executive floors. Thomas has been granted unusual freedom to move throughout the resort, Marcus replied carefully. He's very conscientious about maintaining standards. Isabella frowned. Something about the way Marcus spoke about a mere janitor seemed oddly deferential, but she dismissed the thought. She had more important things to focus on, like figuring out how to endure 6 months of what she already knew would be insufferable tedium. The next morning, Isabella arrived at the resort, determined to make the best of her situation. She'd spent the evening researching hospitality management online and was confident she could expedite her learning process. After all, how difficult could it be to run a hotel? Her confidence wavered when she was assigned to shadow Alina Martinez, the head of housekeeping. Alina was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes but a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put Isabella on edge. Start with room inspections, Alina explained, leading Isabella down a corridor lined with guest rooms. Each room must meet exact standards before we consider it ready for guests. Isabella followed reluctantly, her designer outfit feeling increasingly inappropriate as they moved through the service areas of the hotel. When they entered the first room, she was surprised to find Thomas there, carefully replacing a light bulb in one of the bedside lamps. "Good morning, Alina," he said warmly, then nodded to Isabella, Miss Chen. There was something in his tone, respectful but not subservient, that irritated her. Most service workers she'd encountered seemed intimidated by her family's wealth and status, but this man seemed utterly unaffected by her presence. "Shouldn't he be finished by now?" Isabella asked Alina, loud enough for Thomas to hear. "How long does it take to change a light bulb?" Thomas looked up from his work and once again, Isabella caught that strange glint in his eyes. "I was also checking the electrical outlets and testing the air conditioning unit," he said quietly. "I noticed the temperature wasn't consistent yesterday." "Yesterday?" Isabella turned to Alina. "How would he know about temperature issues from yesterday? Is he monitoring guest complaints now, too?" Alina shifted uncomfortably. "Thomas is very attentive to details that might affect guest satisfaction." Isabella felt a surge of frustration. There was clearly something she wasn't being told about this peculiar janitor, but every time she tried to probe deeper, the staff became evasive. As the days passed, her irritation only grew, especially as Thomas seemed to materialize wherever she was working. Always watching, always taking mental notes of her interactions with both staff and guests, she had no idea that her every word and action were being carefully evaluated by the one person whose opinion would ultimately determine her future at Serenity Bay Resort. Shattered pride. The third week of Isabella's internship began with what she considered her first real opportunity to demonstrate leadership. Marcus had reluctantly agreed to let her sit in on the Monday morning staff meeting, though he'd made it clear she was there to observe, not participate. The conference room buzzed with quiet conversation as department heads filed in: Alina from housekeeping, Roberto Silva from the kitchen, Diana Walsh from guest relations, and several others Isabella had barely bothered to learn about. To her surprise, Thomas entered as well, taking a seat in the back corner with a notepad in his weathered hands. "Why is the janitor here?" Isabella whispered to Marcus, not bothering to lower her voice much. "Thomas often provides valuable insights about facility maintenance and guest experience," Marcus replied stiffly. Isabella rolled her eyes. The idea that a janitor's opinions mattered in management decisions struck her as absurd. In her world, people stayed in their lanes, and custodial staff certainly didn't contribute to strategic planning. The meeting proceeded through routine updates, occupancy rates, guest satisfaction scores, upcoming events. Isabella found herself growing bored until Marcus mentioned a concerning trend in the guest feedback forms. "We're seeing repeated complaints about inconsistent service standards," Marcus explained, pulling up a presentation. "Guests report feeling unwelcome by certain staff members, and we've had several incidents where our hospitality fell short of expectations." Thomas raised his hand slightly. "If I may, I've noticed some patterns in my daily rounds that might be relevant." Isabella couldn't contain herself. "I'm sorry, but why exactly are we taking service advice from someone whose job is to empty trash cans?" She turned to face Thomas directly. "No offense, but management decisions should probably be left to people who actually understand business." The room fell silent. Lena looked mortified, while Marcus appeared to be choosing his words very carefully. Thomas, however, remained calm, that same unreadable expression on his face. "What patterns have you observed, Thomas?" Marcus asked, pointedly ignoring Isabella's outburst. "I've noticed that guest complaints often spike after interactions with staff who seem more focused on hierarchy than hospitality," Thomas said quietly. "People can sense when they're being judged or dismissed, even in subtle ways." Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks.
"Oh.
"Are you implying something?" "I'm simply sharing what I've observed," Thomas replied. "Guest satisfaction tends to be highest when every team member, regardless of their role, treats each visitor with genuine respect and attention." "That's rich, coming from someone who probably never even finished college," Isabella snapped. "I've been studying business and customer relations my entire life. I think I understand hospitality better than someone who mops floors for a living." The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella noticed several staff members exchanging glances, and Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. But Thomas simply nodded, made a note in his pad, and said nothing more. The meeting concluded awkwardly, with Isabella feeling vindicated but somehow unsatisfied. She'd put the presumptuous janitor in his place, but the looks she was getting from other staff members suggested they didn't appreciate her directness. 2 days later, disaster struck. Isabella was working the front desk under Sophia Reyes's supervision when a prominent food critic arrived for an unannounced review. Sophia had stepped away to handle a phone call, leaving Isabella alone when the critic approached. "I have a reservation." Under Morrison, the woman said. She was dressed casually, jeans, a simple blouse, no obvious signs of wealth or status. Isabella barely looked up from her phone. Morrison, let me check. She scrolled through the reservation system with obvious impatience. I don't see anything under that name. You sure you booked with us? I'm quite certain, the woman replied, her tone cooling slightly. Well, it's not here, Isabella said dismissively. Maybe you made a mistake. Not everyone can just book a room here. The woman's eyebrows rose. Excuse me, I'm just saying this is a luxury resort. Maybe you're thinking of one of the other hotels in the area? Isabella's tone was condescending, clearly suggesting the woman couldn't afford to stay there. What Isabella didn't know was that Thomas had been replacing flowers in the lobby and had overheard the entire exchange. He quickly approached the desk, his demeanor professional but urgent. Ms. Chen, might I suggest checking under M. Morrison? Sometimes reservations are filed under initials, he said quietly. Isabella shot him an annoyed look. I think I can handle this without input from housekeeping. Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he stepped back. The woman at the desk, however, had heard enough. Actually, I think there's been quite enough handling already, she said coldly. I'm Margaret Morrison from Luxury Travel Quarterly, and I was planning to write a feature about this resort. But I think I've seen everything I need to see. Isabella's blood ran cold. Sophia chose that moment to return, took one look at the scene, and immediately went into damage control mode. But it was too late. Margaret Morrison left without checking in, and within hours, Marcus was in crisis management mode. Do you have any idea what you've done? Marcus demanded when he called Isabella into his office. Margaret Morrison has nearly 2 million readers. Her reviews can make or break luxury properties. How was I supposed to know who she was? Isabella protested. She looked like anyone. Exactly. Marcus exploded. That's the point. We treat every guest like they matter, because they do. This is basic hospitality, something Thomas tried to help you understand, and you dismissed him like he was nothing. Isabella felt a sinking sensation in her stomach. Through the office window, she could see Thomas in the lobby, methodically watering plants while somehow managing to keep an eye on the front desk operations. For the first time, she noticed how other staff members seemed to naturally defer to his presence, seeking his quiet guidance on various matters. There's something you're not telling me about him, she said suddenly. Marcus paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. Thomas is ... more observant than most. He sees things others miss, understands people in ways that can't be taught. Maybe you should try listening to him instead of dismissing him. That evening, Isabella sat in her luxury apartment, staring. At her phone, where her mother's disappointed voicemail played on repeat, word of the Morrison incident had already reached Victoria Chen, and Isabella knew she was running out of chances to prove herself worthy of the family business. For the first time since arriving at Serenity Bay, she found herself wondering who Thomas really was, and why everyone seemed to treat a janitor with such unusual respect. The answer would come sooner than she expected, and it would shatter everything she thought she knew about power, respect, and her own place in the world. The revelation, the quarterly board meeting, was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late July, and Isabella had been looking forward to it for weeks. Finally, she would be in a room with real decision-makers, people who understood business, the way she did. Her mother had insisted she attend as part of her educational experience. Though Isabella suspected it was more about damage control after the Morrison incident, she arrived at the resort's executive conference room. 30 minutes. Early, dressed in her most professional outfit, a tailored navy suit that had cost more than most people's monthly rent. The room was impressive. With floor-toozling windows overlooking the ocean and a massive mahogany table that could seat 20 people, Marcus was already there, nervously shuffling through papers along with James Mitchell, a silver-haired board member Isabella recognized from previous family gatherings. Anna Foster, her mother's executive assistant, was setting up presentation materials at the far end of the room. Isabella James greeted her with a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. How are you finding your internship experience? Educational. Isabella replied diplomatically, though internally she was still smarting from the criticism she'd received over the past few weeks. Everyone seemed to think she needed to learn humility, but she was confident that once she was among her peers, actual executives and decision-makers, her natural business instincts would be appreciated. Other board members began filing in, sophisticated men and women in expensive suits, carrying leather briefcases and speaking in the measured tones of people accustomed to wielding power. Isabella felt herself relaxing for the first time in weeks. These were her people. Victoria Chen entered precisely at 9 o'clock, commanding the room's attention without saying a word. She was an elegant woman in her 50s, with the kind of presence that came from building a hospitality empire from nothing. She took her seat at the head of the table and surveyed the assembled group. "Before we begin with quarterly reports," Victoria announced, "I want to address the elephant in the room. We've all received feedback about service inconsistencies at Serenity Bay, and I believe it's time we heard from someone who's been conducting a comprehensive evaluation of our operations." Isabella frowned slightly. She hadn't been told about any comprehensive evaluation, and she wondered if this was related to the Morrison incident or if there were other problems she wasn't aware of. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria continued, "I'd like you to meet the person who's been working undercover at Serenity Bay for the past 6 months, assessing everything from staff morale to guest experience to leadership potential." The conference room door opened, and Isabella turned expectantly, assuming some high-priced consultant would enter. Instead, Thomas walked in, but not the Thomas she knew. Gone was the janitor's uniform, replaced by an impeccably tailored charcoal suit. His posture was different too, no longer the slightly stooped stance of a maintenance worker, but the confident bearing of someone used to commanding rooms. Full of powerful people, Isabella's mouth fell open as Thomas, or whoever he really was, walked to the front of the room with the easy confidence of someone who belonged there. He moved to the presentation screen and smiled at the assembled board members, several of whom were nodding at him with obvious familiarity. "Thank you, Victoria," he said, and even his voice seemed different, still quiet, but with an authority that filled the room. "For those who don't know me, I'm Thomas Ward, CEO of Ward Hospitality Consulting. I've spent the last 6 months working at various levels within your organization to assess operational efficiency, staff development, and succession planning." Isabella felt the world tilt around her. CEO, the man she'd been dismissing as an incompetent janitor, was a CEO? She looked around the room frantically, expecting someone to laugh to reveal this as some kind of joke. But every face was serious, professional, attentive. "My findings," Thomas continued, clicking to the first slide of his presentation, "reveal both significant strengths and some concerning areas for improvement. Your staff, by and large, is dedicated and skilled. Your facilities are world-class. However, there are leadership challenges that could seriously impact your brand's reputation if not addressed." He clicked to the next slide, which showed guest satisfaction scores over the past 6 months. Isabella noticed a disturbing downward trend that coincided almost exactly with her arrival at the resort. "Guest complaints have increased by 37% since June," Thomas explained. "The common thread in these complaints is a perception that certain staff members are dismissive, condescending, or more focused on hierarchy than hospitality." Isabella's palms were sweating. She could feel her mother's eyes on her, along with those of every board member in the room. Thomas clicked to another slide showing employee satisfaction surveys. Staff morale has also declined, with several employees reporting feeling undervalued or disrespected by management. This creates a trickle-down effect that ultimately impacts guest experience. "Can you be more specific about the source of these issues?" James Mitchell asked. Though his glance toward Isabella suggested he already suspected the answer. Thomas paused, and for the first time since entering the room, his eyes met Isabella's directly. There was no malice in his gaze, but there was a sadness that cut deeper than anger would have. "In my assessment, the primary issue stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of what hospitality means," Thomas said carefully. "True hospitality isn't about maintaining social hierarchies or demonstrating superiority. It's about making every person, guest, or colleague feel valued and respected, regardless of their position or background. He clicked to a new slide, titled Case Studies. And Isabella's heart sank as she recognized several of her own interactions with staff and guests, though thankfully they were described anonymously. I observed multiple instances where promising team members were dismissed or undermined simply because of their job titles. Thomas continued. This not only damages morale, but also wastes valuable human resources. Some of our most insightful observations about guest satisfaction came from housekeeping staff, maintenance workers, and frontline employees, people who interact with guests daily but whose opinions were consistently ignored or belittled. The room was silent except for the soft scratching of pens as board members took notes. Isabella felt sick, knowing that everyone in the room was connecting the dots. Realizing that she was the unnamed manager whose behavior had prompted this entire evaluation, Victoria Chen finally spoke. Thomas, what are your recommendations for addressing these leadership issues? Thomas looked directly at Isabella again, and this time his expression was gentler, almost sympathetic. I recommend a comprehensive leadership development program, focused on emotional intelligence, humility, and genuine service orientation. The individual in question has potential, but needs to understand that real leadership comes from lifting others up, not putting them down. And if that development isn't successful, James Mitchell asked bluntly, then you'll need to make difficult decisions about succession planning, Thomas replied. The hospitality industry is built on trust and reputation. Both can be destroyed by leaders who don't understand that every interaction matters, whether it's with a celebrity guest or a night shift janitor. As the meeting concluded and board members began filing out, Isabella sat frozen in her chair, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. The man she'd humiliated, dismissed, and condescended to for weeks was not only a successful CEO, but had been documenting her every failure in professional leadership. Thomas approached her as the room emptied. His expression kind but serious. Isabella, I know this is a shock, but I want you to know that this evaluation wasn't personal. It was about understanding whether you're ready for the responsibilities that come with leading a company like this. Isabella looked up at him, seeing him clearly for the first time. You must think I'm a terrible person. I think you're a young woman who's never been taught the difference between authority and leadership, Thomas said quietly. The question now is whether you're willing to learn. For the first time in her privileged life, Isabella Chen realized she had a choice to make: continue believing she was entitled to respect based on her last name and bank balance, or earn it through the kind of character she was only beginning to understand. The man standing before her, the one she'd so thoroughly underestimated, was offering her a chance at redemption she wasn't sure she deserved. Learning to seethe morning after the board meeting. Isabella stood in her apartment bathroom, staring at her reflection and barely recognizing the person looking back. The confident, entitled young woman who had arrived at Serenity Bay 2 months ago seemed like a stranger now. In her place was someone uncertain, humbled, and for the first time in her life, genuinely ashamed of her behavior. Her phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. If you're willing, I'd like to offer you a different kind of education. Meet me in the staff break room at 7 a.m. Isabella's first instinct was to ignore the message. Her pride was wounded, her ego shattered, and the easiest thing would be to pack her bags and return to her mother's corporate headquarters where her failures could be quietly swept under the rug. But something about Thomas's calm demeanor during yesterday's confrontation, the absence of vindictiveness, despite how cruelly she'd treated him, made her curious about what he might teach her. She arrived at the staff break room 5 minutes early, wearing jeans and a simple blouse instead of her usual designer armor. Thomas was already there, back in casual clothes that made him look approachable rather than intimidating. He was sitting at a small table with 2 cups of coffee and what appeared to be staff schedules spread out before him. Thank you for coming, he said simply. I wasn't sure you would. Isabella took the seat across from him, accepting the coffee gratefully. I almost didn't. But I realized I don't actually know what I'd be running away to. Everything I thought I understood about business, about leadership, about myself, ... It all feels wrong now. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes we have to unlearn before we can truly learn. He slid one of the schedules across the table to her. Roberto Silva, our head chef, has been with the resort for 8 years. He started as a prep cook, worked his way up through every position in the kitchen, supports his elderly mother, and puts his younger sister through culinary school. Team respects him because he never asks them to do anything he hasn't done himself. Isabella studied the schedule, seeing Roberto's name penciled in for nearly 60 hours that week. Why are you telling me this? Because yesterday you walked through his kitchen and complained that the staff looked tired. You suggested to Marcus that maybe we needed more motivated employees, but you never asked Roberto why his team was working extra shifts or what challenges they were facing. The criticism stung because it was accurate. Isabella remembered making that comment, frustrated by what she perceived as low energy among the kitchen staff. What was I supposed to ask? How about how are you holding up? Or what can I do to help? Thomas suggested gently. Roberto's team was covering for 2 cooks who were out with COVID. They were tired because they were working double shifts to maintain service quality. Instead of recognizing their dedication, you questioned their commitment. Over the next several hours, Thomas walked Isabella through similar stories about other staff members. Diana Walsh, who was pursuing her MBA while working full-time in guest relations. Michael Brown, the security chief who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and whose attention to detail had prevented 3 potential security incidents in the past month. Lena Martinez, whose housekeeping innovations had increased efficiency by 20% while improving guest satisfaction scores. I had no idea, Isabella admitted as they sat in the employee cafeteria for lunch. Surrounded by the very people she'd been dismissing for months. I just saw their job titles and made assumptions about their capabilities. That's the problem with looking down on people, Thomas said. It's watching as Roberto personally delivered a special meal to Alina, who was celebrating her daughter's graduation. You miss everything that makes them remarkable. That afternoon, Thomas introduced Isabella to what he called shadow learning, following different employees through their actual work, rather than observing from a management perspective. Her first assignment was with Diana Walsh in guest relations. Secret, Diana explained as they handled a complaint from a guest whose room air conditioning had failed, is to listen for what they're not saying. This guest isn't really angry about the temperature. He's stressed because his wife has been sick. They're on their first vacation in 3 years, and he's worried this will ruin her chance to relax. Isabella watched as Diana not only arranged for immediate room repair, but also sent a complimentary bottle of wine and arranged for late checkout so the couple wouldn't feel rushed. The transformation in the guest's demeanor was remarkable. How did you know all that about his situation? Isabella asked afterward. I asked questions and actually listened to the answers, Diana replied. Most people will tell you what's really bothering them if you give them the space to do it. The revelation was humbling. Isabella realized she'd been so focused on projecting authority that she'd never developed the skill of truly listening to others. Her next assignment was with Michael Brown, learning about the security systems that kept the resort safe. As they walked the property, Michael pointed out dozens of details Isabella had never noticed, sight lines that prevented blind spots, lighting designed to make guests feel safe without being intrusive, discreet camera placements that provided coverage without compromising privacy. Security isn't about looking tough, Michael explained. It's about creating an environment where people feel protected without feeling watched. The best security is invisible until it's needed. As the days passed, Isabella found herself genuinely looking forward to these learning sessions. Each employee taught her something different, not just about their specific roles, but about observation, patience, and the kind of attention to detail that elevated good service to exceptional hospitality. Thomas was always present but never intrusive during these sessions, taking notes in his ever-present notebook and occasionally asking questions that helped Isabella see connections she might have missed. She began to understand that his months as a janitor had been the most comprehensive management training program she could have imagined. One evening, as they were reviewing the day's lessons over coffee in the resort's quiet lounge, Isabella worked up the courage to ask the question that had been nagging at her for weeks. Why did you really take this assignment? I mean, you're obviously successful enough that you don't need the work. Why spend 6 months mopping floors and being insulted by people like me? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the ocean visible through the lounge's floor-to-ceiling windows. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than usual. I lost my wife 5 years ago. Cancer. During her final months, we spent a lot of time in hospitals. And I saw how differently staff treated us based on assumptions about our insurance, our education, our background. The nurses and orderlies who took the time to see Sarah as a person, not just a patient, made her last days bearable. The ones who didn't, he trailed off, then looked directly at Isabella. I promised myself I'd never let position or title become more important than treating people with dignity. Isabella felt tears prick her eyes. I'm so sorry about your wife and about how I treated you. I don't know how you stayed so kind when I was being so awful. Because I could see that your behavior came from fear, not malice, Thomas said gently. Fear of not measuring up, of not being taken seriously, of not being worthy of the respect you were demanding. But respect can't be demanded, Isabella. It can only be earned. As they sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the ocean, Isabella realized something had fundamentally shifted inside her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't thinking about what she deserved or what she was entitled to. Instead, she was thinking about what she could contribute, what she could learn, and how she might earn the kind of quiet respect that Thomas commanded, simply by being genuinely interested in the people around him. She was also beginning to recognize another feeling growing alongside her newfound humility, a deep admiration for the man who had shown her such patience and grace. Despite having every reason to write her off completely, it was a dangerous realization. One that complicated everything she thought she understood about her future, but one she could no longer ignore.